And then that will allow us to have that right on the Meetup's website for you guys to be able to see that information. So if I have done that correctly, we should actually be recording right now. Let me just make sure that's proper. Hold on. Yep, we are recording. Perfect. I want to say thank you. Sorry, going back here, jumping ahead early. I'm having some lag here. Give me a moment. Hello. Let's go back. Here we go. All right, the joys of doing things live. Thank you to our sponsor. Everybody clap. Yo. Thank you, Concord, for sponsoring. They sponsor today. All of the prizes that you can potentially win are going to be coming from our friends at Concord. Great partners of ours. Feel free to get to know them. Some of them are actually here on this meeting request, or this Meetup meeting. So reach out to them if you have any questions. They would love to help you implement your integration strategy as well as data integration and data warehousing strategies. Thanks again, Concord. All right, let's get going here. So a couple things on the charter. We talk about this every time, but I just want to make sure that we get an opportunity to address it again. We need members. We need people to show up, right? When we are able to meet again in person, we're going to need organizations that are willing to host. We have had a few do it. Buffalo Wild Wings has done it. Concord has done it. We've had, Johnson Brothers has done this as well. So we'd love for people that want to host. I know Land O'Lakes talked about wanting to do it in the future, and so we hope to be able to do that. But if you're interested in hosting, there's some value in doing that, and we'd love for the opportunity. And of course, speakers. So right now we have a lot of the speakers are going to be leaders and those that have spoken in the past, but we'd love for you to talk about your use cases or even a small short tip as you're going to see today. We got two quicker tips that just allow the community to be able to do a better job of implementing and using MuleSoft effectively. So it's not about whether you're done with something and it's seen huge success. If there's something you learned that you think is valuable for the community, reach out to us from a leadership perspective. We'd love to be able to get you guys on that agenda to do that. What's in it for you to doing that? Well, speakers, per speaking engagement, you get 1 training credit and 1 certification exam credit, right? So this is actually of true value. We're talking about thousands of dollars of value here. So take the opportunity, utilize that. Even with the 10-minute tip, you're going to get this. So think about that. There's value in that. Want to win something? What can we win today? So thanks again to Concord for this, but we have 3 $25 DoorDash gift cards, and we love the opportunity. We hope that you're able to use these on some local business that you have, like a restaurant you love to go to. Want to be able to make sure that these businesses are able to stay open in this difficult time from financial perspective. So please use that in a local setup so that you can actually help some of your local businesses. Starbucks, you like coffee? We all like coffee. So we got 3 $5 Starbucks gift cards coming, and then we are going to be giving away 3 training credits as well. So now we don't require this time because you're going to be receiving an email after this meetup is complete to fill out a feedback form. Please, 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 please fill out that feedback form. It's very helpful for us as an organization to make sure we as a community are driving the right content to the community, that we're providing value. So if you could please fill that out, that would be very, very helpful. Really, it's about helping you. It has nothing to do with us as leaders. We are nothing more than helping to facilitate this group. We are not leading it like we run the thing. It's just we're helping with facilitation. We need your information so that we can make sure that we're providing that relevant content. So again, please do that. We'd love for you to provide that feedback. Thank you very much. And with that, we are going to jump right on in. I'm going to turn over control to our buddy Raghav, who is one of our leaders as well. And he's got a presentation around API security. Raghav?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. And in last meetup, we did collect some feedback, and I looked at the topics and suggestions that some of our folks made, and a lot of folks said, you guys are talking way too much, so bring it back down a level and talk about the basics. So I thought, let's talk about some basic API security, and what do we have in Anypoint platform to support that API security that we would like to put in place. Are you guys able to see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, we are.
Okay. So let's jump right in. So let's just talk about the API security and what are the policies we have in Anypoint platform and how can we utilize it to keep it consistent, to keep it easy, not over complicate any security needs, but at the same time, keeping things secure. Who am I? Just integration architect at Concord, and some contact details if you'd like to reach out to me later on. Just to make sure everyone knows who you're listening to, I had to put up a slide with my name and my face on it. And who is Concord? So just a quick overview on what is Concord as a company and what do we do. Not going to talk about it too much, but do want to give a quick overview of what we do and our partnership with MuleSoft. We are a preferred partner in the area with MuleSoft, and we have a complex integration experience. So if you would like to talk about any of your use cases, feel free to reach us out. All right, with that said, let's move on to the agenda. Let's see what we have in agenda. We have a quick review of what is API security, and we'll do a quick review of API manager. What are the policies we have? What are the out-of-the-box security policies? How do we categorize these APIs to apply policies? We have various kind of APIs when we are trying to build a API network, right? How do we keep them secure, and how do we apply these policies based on some categorization that will help any organizations to start thinking about categorizing the security of the APIs. We'll have a quick review on OAuth 2.0 review. OAuth 2.0. Most of my presentation will be emphasizing on securing the APIs using OAuth 2.0 with Okta. I've used Okta as an authorization server. Okta integrates pretty well with any point platform, and in fact, any OpenID Connect compliant authorization servers will work just fine with any point platform. It also supports Ping Federate and OpenAM, and some testing time as well. Once we apply a OAuth policy, how do we test it? So in the interest of time, I might just show some screenshots, but if we have time, I'm happy to walk you through the configurations that I have done in the Anypoint platform as well. I just shooted up a trial accounts to set this up in order to show it to you guys. You have time? All right. So why do we need API security, or what is even API security, right? In the world of APIs that we're talking about, cloud-based infrastructure and whatnot, so application level security becomes a very key, because some of our APIs might be opening up access to some of the protected data, which were sitting in some database in a corner of the data center, which is not usually exposed to the outside world. But with the APIs and whatnot, we are trying to make the data access easy, connectivity to systems easy. But if we are trying to open up that door, we need to make sure we put a security in front of it. And last but not the least, I would like to say each API request should come with some sort of authentication credentials, right? Which must be validated on every request. Ideally, we shouldn't be storing any sessions or cookies and trying to validate the authentication or authorize an API request based on prior requests that came in from the same consumer. Or something like that. Say I'm done with the security, kind of pretend like I have my API secured. Maybe not. Or do I do big bang and try to form a maze and make it difficult to access my API? Probably we have a middle ground where we can agree. Some of the thumb rules: keep it simple, secure an API how secure it should be. If you are exposing a public API which is not sensitive, you doesn't have to overcomplicate it when it doesn't need to be. Always use HTTPS, which is as a best practice, to just establish an encrypted link between two parties, right? Never expose sensitive information on your URLs. Some of the frameworks do talk about passing access tokens in the URL and the usernames and passwords, but I would advise against that. And try to use standard frameworks as much as we can, right? For example, OAuth 2.0. And when it comes to the input parameter validation, try to put some strict input parameter validation. And fortunately, in any point platform, we have RAML where we can write data types and have it validated right at the API kit router layer so that it doesn't, the bad request doesn't get to the application logic, and it reduces the possibility of injection attacks or whatnot, right? All right, so let's review API manager policies. What do we have in API manager in order to apply and secure our APIs? Some of the out-of-the-box policies we have, like when we talk about policy categories, we have compliance, where we can enable CARs, client ID enforcements, quality of services, where we can do rate limiting, HTTP caching, and spike control. Transformations like header injections and header removals, troubleshooting, and finally the security. So today we're gonna focus and emphasize on the security policies. And if we look at the security policies, we have all sorts of security policies that can be applied to our APIs. Out of the box, you don't need to do any customization. You can simply use and enable your API with the auto discovery that hooks up your API into API manager, and you can configure all these policies. And you can do automated policies as well, right? So you can set up certain environment where every API should have a certain policy. So you can make use of automated policies. And today we are going to do a deep dive on how to set up OpenID Connect or token enforcement policies on our APIs. And so we are talking about a lot of APIs, experience APIs, process APIs, system APIs, a lot of APIs in the API network. One transaction is going through multiple APIs in order to fulfill your request, right? So good starting point would be categorize your APIs based on what is being exposed in your APIs. For example, I have some categories here where I have used as a starting point in the past, right? So level one, I would consider as any APIs that is exposing your sensitive data to the end user or on the public internet, which are accessible outside of your organization. So the risk of these APIs being attacked are the highest, right? So for example, use case would be banking APIs. All of the experience APIs and proxy APIs that are accessible to your public internet comes under this category. What are some policies that I should be applying to these sets of APIs? We should be considering OAuth 2.0 or JWT validation with a combination of client ID enforcement, spike control, JSON threat protection, and CARs policies for those APIs that are interacting with your web clients to make sure the cross-origin resource sharing and all of that, you're trusting only the trusted origin, all of that jazz. So the level 2 category that I would define as is like you are exposing sensitive data, but not to the external network. You are exposing this data to the internal network. So the risk of APIs being attacked are still high, but less probable because you're not exposing this to the public network, and these are well within your network firewall and corporate firewall. So for example, a simple use case would be marketing department accessing the customer data through your APIs, right? So all the APIs such as experience, process, and system level layer APIs will be considered in this category. And what should we be considering when it comes to policies for applying to these APIs to secure those APIs? OAuth 2.0 should still be considered here, since it is sharing the sensitive data. With OAuth 2.0, we are exchanging the tokens rather than credentials, and the token has a certain lifetime of expiry. So even if if the token is exposed, your risk is potentially mitigated. And let's look at the next two categories. So the another category would be you're exposing critical business functionality, but to internal network only. Probability of the attacker to get to such APIs is relatively low because there's not really a sensitive data here. For example, like an address validation API that your organization is using internally, right? There is not a lot of high sensitive data here, but you still need to secure your APIs at least with client ID enforcement and CORS policies if your APIs are communicating with your web clients. Spike control and JSON threat protection can be applied, but those are optional. And when it comes to the level 4, these APIs are non-critical business functionality and not exposing any sensitive data or not exposing any useful data, right? So this is just an API that that doesn't contain the business data and is very rarely called within an organization. So these APIs can simply be applied with a client ID enforcement. So if we are just doing a client ID enforcement and not applying other policies to the APIs that are being exposed outside of the network, essentially we are doing this in my view. You're just thinking that our APIs is secure, but they are prone to attacks. All right, let's take a look at what is OAuth 2.0 framework. But before we jump into that, anyone have any questions? All right, I take it.
Is everyone able to see Raghav's screen? Because I can't, Raghav.
I'm seeing the presentation.
I'm able to see it. Yeah, we're seeing it.
Okay.
Okay.
For some reason.
That saves my heartache. I was thinking like, I'm talking for 10 minutes and no one is seeing my screen. Okay.
Maybe I'm connected with the browser and that's the issue. I'll get to the app.
All right. Most of the folks is able to see. Can we continue or do we want to wait for a couple minutes for folks to figure it out? Right. I'm taking that as a yes to go ahead. Right. Let's see what is OAuth 2.0. It's just a protocol that and a standard framework that allows users to grant limited access to the data or resources on one side to the other without having to expose the credentials, right? So the way we do authentication is we exchange tokens and we validate tokens and what is OpenID Connect now? Can everyone go on mute if you're not talking? I'm hearing echo. Thanks. So what is OpenID Connect? So it is just an identity layer on top of OAuth 2.0. It enables clients to verify identity of the end user based on some authentications performed by mediation authorization server, right? So there's a party in between who is authorizing the access. So some of the roles that we hear when we talk about OAuth 2.0, resource owners or users, client applications. We have an authorization server, and I just use Okta for this example, and then the resource server are your end application servers. So when we talk about OAuth, we have a concept of grant types as well. It's just a mechanism of how you are able to acquire your token and how we are able to manage the token, right? So authorization code is one of it. Authorization code is usually a redirection flow where users authenticate and then token is passed across for the calling APIs. Client credentials, it is usually used in terms of like mostly in B2B transactions, or if you, in our scenario, if your process API needs to communicate with your system API, and if you want to keep it simple and if you don't want to involve authorization code, complex redirection flows and whatnot, you can set up your client application to be able to grant the tokens based on just the client ID and secret that you're presenting in your request. And a couple other, or like implicit is usually used by the single page apps, not a widely used one. Resource owner is rarely used as well, in as far as I understand it. So because that deals with trusting the end client application with your password and whatnot. All right, when we talk about OAuth though, OAuth, we talk about OAuth dance. So what is OAuth dance? Is it something like this? Yeah, well, could be. But OAuth 2.0 exchange and OAuth dance looks something like this in terms of authorization code grant flow, right? So the client applications will be sending an authorization request to authorization server, and authorization server will redirect and have the user grant the access, and it will respond with the authorization code back to the client application. Now, client application will send a token request using the auth code, authorization code that it received in the earlier request, and get back the access token. And that access token is what is being passed to access your APIs, right? Authorization header. So it could be bearer token. Once the resource server, or in this case, your Mule application gets it, it always validates, it always goes to your authorization server and validates that token, whether to introspect the token, whether it's a valid token, what are the scopes that are assigned to this particular token, and some basic information of the user that requested the token. If it deems the token is valid, it serves the request and it responds with data to the user. And there is a exchange refresh token flow as well. So when a token is expired, you can keep refreshing it up to a certain point until it expires completely. So let's see how the client credentials grant flow looks like. Client applications request the token from authorization server, but purely based on the client ID and secret of the client application. Authorization server responds with a refresh access token, and the rest of it looks same as authorization code flow. The only difference between these two is the first one is being redirected for the user to enter the credentials and generate the authorization code and then issue the token, whereas in the client credentials flow, we are requesting the token directly by presenting the client ID and secret. All right, so just to walk through details on how do we connect our authorization servers with any point platform, and how do we apply policy, OpenID Connect policy on the API that has been deployed to any point Cloud Hub or Runtime Fabric or even a on-prem server. So in the interest of time, as I said earlier, I'm just using my screenshots that I've used to set up. But towards the end, if you have time, I'm happy to walk through within the applications as well. So since we are talking about hooking up the Okta server, Okta authorization server with any point platform for client management, we need to set up a Okta account. So for demonstration purposes, I have used a Okta developer account. Ideally, if you're working at an organization, we already have an authorization server, or at least a third-party service such as Okta or Ping Federate or some OpenAM. So we just create the Okta account and we go into Okta, authorization servers, and we make sure that there is an authorization server assigned to this. So I just use the default authorization server that Okta developer account provides and renamed it as with my name, Raghav Demo. I love having an authorization server with my name and even companies with my name, right? So once we go into the default authorization server, and if we take a look at the Okta page, it also displays the authorization server's metadata URI. What does this metadata URI provides? It provides some public information on like what is the issuer endpoint URL, what is the authorization endpoint URL, what is the token endpoint URL. So when you're communicating from the other applications with this authorization server, these are some of the endpoint URLs that you will be communicating with. So the key ones would be authorization endpoint, token endpoint, client registration endpoint, and then the token introspection endpoint. Token introspection endpoint is nothing but you can pass a token and get a validity of the token and what are the scopes of the token and all of the information about the token. All right, once we have that, we need also, since our authorization server is all set, now we need a token to be able to connect any point platform into your authorization server. So for that, we will just go to the tokens tab on the authorization servers, on the API authorization servers tokens, and we create a new token. For the demonstration purposes, I just created a token with the name Anypoint Platform Security Demo, right? So once the token is created, we have to make sure this token is saved. As far as I know, we can't get a hold of this token again once this token is created. If you have to generate a new token, you'd have to create new one. So better save it if you're trying this. And now we need to add a service application in Okta so that Anypoint platform.
So Raghav, how long the token is valid in this case?
So this SSWS token is valid for, there is no time frame on this one, but you can set a certain expiry. In this case, I have set an expiry of 1 month, but you can always set this expiry to whatever you want, because this token is used for dynamic client registration in your Anypoint, right? So when you're doing a request access on an API and creating an application, it needs to communicate with your authorization server in order to access the open APIs to register your client application.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
And since we now have the token, and also we need one more client application where Anypoint platform is the client application in this scenario. Anytime when a API request comes into your API gateway layer, you would want to take that particular token and go to authorization server, present your we need to create a service account in Okta. You can, for demonstration purpose, again, I just use the security demo external identity. And once you create that, you do see that client ID and client secret is generated, which you need to hook these into Anypoint platform when you're configuring client provider. We'll go into that in a moment. Since we have all the client application detail, we have the SSWS token that we need in order to register your authorization server in Anypoint platform. So if you go to the access management, there is a tab called client providers, and within client providers, there is a option. If you drop down of add a client provider, you will see the available options. In this use case, we are picking the OpenID Connect Dynamic Client Registration. For those of you who have seen this in the past, you might have seen that there was a tab with external identity, and once you go into external identity, you could go into either identity management or client management, right? Identity management was the way to do single sign-on into any point platform, whereas the client management was to do all of this similar setup. But with the latest release, we have a separate tab for the client management now, client providers. I don't know how many of you have noticed, but with the latest release of the Anypoint platform, I think last month in April, if I'm not wrong, we can now assign multiple identity servers for client management, and you can pick and choose which API, which environment, which business org you want to use certain identity provider. So what this brings is, this brings a flexibility of segregating some security practices and whatnot to have a separate identity servers for the internal versus the external and whatnot. If you, some organizations have separate identity servers for non-production versus production, right? So earlier that was a limitation, but with the latest release, we can do that now. So how do we configure the client provider in Anypoint platform? We just go to OpenID Connect Dynamic Client Registration page, and we get we fill in the information like issuer URLs, client registration URLs, authorization header. So you should add a SSWS space the token that you have generated in the Okta, right? And there are some options here, whether to enable the client deletion in Anypoint platform and whether to enable client deletion and updates in your identity platform as well. All of these URLs should have, you should have seen in the that public metadata URI call that you can make. Once we fill in, there is a token introspection client details and OpenID Connect authorization URLs. This client ID and client secret was the one that we generated for Anypoint platform as a client in Okta that can be used while it is making token introspection calls to Okta server. And some authorization URLs here, authorized token and token introspection, all of these will be part of your public metadata of your authorization server. Once you create this, as you can see, once it will show up in a list, and the assigned environments is 0. Whereas in earlier, until like very recently, when you create a client management identity provider, it is assigned to every organization, every, when I say organization, business groups in your organization, every environment. So there was no way to assign one identity for one business group versus the other. With this latest release, it gives us that flexibility. That comes with an additional step. Now, since we have created the client providers, now we go to access management environments. And within the environments page, once you click on a certain environment, there is a option called client provider, and you can drop down and pick and choose which identity server that you would like your environment to use. And with this configuration, now we have enabled the OpenID Connect in Anypoint platform. If you go into the environment that you have assigned the your client provider for example, in this demo, I went into the API manager demo, and I went into one of the API and policies, and now I do see that OpenID Connect access token enforcement policy is enabled in my environment. Whereas in the before this configuration, you won't see this policy in your available list of policies to be able to apply for your API. So how do we apply this policy? Just I have created a simple API, and we can just go into API Manager, select an API, and go into policies. We can just click on apply new policies. Once you open that, you have an option whether to say, I would like to apply this for all the API methods and resources or just for these specific resources. You can pick and choose what you want to do. So in this scenario, I would like to just put a blanket security on my API to protect all my resources exposed within this API. And we just click apply, and we got them. We have our API secured with OAuth 2.0. Now, since my API is good and all of that, I got hold of the URL, and now I tried to hit the API from Postman, or you can use any REST API client, right? So I'm not, if you see in my slide, I'm not sending any authorization details and trying to hit the API, and I get 400 bad requests. Access token was not provided. It would expect access token in your authorization header as a bearer token. You could also pass in the access token in the as a parameter as well, but I avoid that whenever possible. And say now, if I'm a hacker, I'm like, all right, I got a hold of the old token that I found through when I was intercepting the network or when I was tracing some logs, right? So let me use that token. I try to use that token, and it says 401 unauthorized because that token has been expired, or this is token that I have tried to malformat. So when the request goes to your API is taking this token out of the authorization header. It is hitting the introspection endpoint of your authorization server, and it is getting the details back and saying, okay, this is not a valid token. I'm not going to grant you the access. All right. Yes, we have to do this right way. We go into Exchange, and we go to the API that we would like to access, and we do click request access, right? Once we click request access, we can create a new client application after selecting the API instance that we would like to gain access to. And if you fill in your application name and what are the grant types that you would like to support, these are the grant types that Anypoint platform supports out of the box: authorization code, implicit, refresh token, and resource owner grant, right? Just for the demonstration purposes, I have filled all of those, and that creates the application. Now, this will look similar to the application. We would have thought, how is this different than the creating the client application within the Exchange itself, right? In this particular scenario, your client application is being replicated to your authorization server. Now, if you go back into Okta, you can see that this particular application is created dynamically using the dynamic client registration URLs and the credentials that you have set up earlier in the configuration, right? So if you go into the details, you can verify that all of the authorization grant types that we have selected when creating application in the Exchange is replicated. One thing to make a note is we cannot have the client credentials since the Anypoint platform doesn't give you the capability to select the client credentials type. That doesn't allow. So if you have to enable client credentials for a certain client application, as far as I know, you would have to do this manually within Okta once the client is registered. So now the test application is registered, great, but who can make sure that there are some users assigned to this client application? So I went ahead and said, everyone in my organization should have access to this client application. All right, now to test this out, I used Postman for demonstration purposes. So I went into Postman, selected the authorization type as OAuth 2.0, And as soon as you hit the get new access token and select the grant type as authorization code, it will ask you for a whole bunch of details like what is your authorization URL, what is your access token URL. These things are something that your client will get from the public metadata of your authorization server. And client ID and client secret is assigned to individual client application. So you do have those details and you request a token. As soon as you request a token, since this is an authorization code flow, it's going to pop up a browser or a pop-up window to have your user log in. Once your user is successfully able to log in, your browser gets the authorization code and Postman makes that call to get the token code using the authorization code. So once you have the authorization code, you can keep using it until your session is open in order to get a new tokens or refresh your token or whatnot. Since we have, go ahead.
Just a quick question. So the client and client secrets in this screenshot. So what are these? Are these the ones from Okta or are these the ones generated in Anypoint platform?
These are the ones that is generated when you have created an application in Exchange. And the values that are shown here are managed within Okta, not in Exchange. These are shown in Exchange though. So those values are same. Yeah, those values are same even if you look at the Exchange or when you look at the Okta as well. These are client application specific, not the user specific.
Understood. Okay. Thank you so much.
And now since we have the token, we can use that token. And when you do the use token, by default, your Postman will add a header with authorization, bearer space, the token value that you have received, right? But you have to do this manually. Say I'm hitting a token call. Once I have the token, I retrieve the token from the payload and add an authorization header with a bearer space, the token value. And then you can see that when you send a request, you will be able to access the data from that GET request. You have the API granted you the access because you have presented a valid token. Say if you use the same token next day, it's going to give you the bad token because the token would have expired by then. So this eliminates the risk of getting a token or a user credentials in a bad hands and keep reiterating the data, right? Because in authorization servers, you can revoke a token at any point of time if you detect malicious activity, and these tokens have an expiry time as well. Great. And now, how do I have achieved the way of securing my API on a complete, but everyone has the same level of access in my organization. How do I control the access of data? So I want my marketing team to be able to read only my customers' data, whereas my customer service team, I would like them to be able to edit the data and create the customers as well if needed, right? How do I control? So any guesses on how can we do a granular control on the resource level data that we are exposing through the APIs? How can we restrict some users to access only GET? How can we users to restrict access some users to restrict only POST and whatnot? Any guesses? All right, we'll just move on since no one is guessing.
So you are talking about securing the data within the payloads, right, Raghav?
So say your API have a customer's GET endpoint and customer's POST endpoint, right? I want some users to be able to only access GET endpoint, not the POST endpoint, because the POST endpoint will let you do the creation of customers.
Yep.
Then custom policies, I guess.
You could set it up in API Manager by resource level.
Yep, and that's a great pointer. How do we control from the authorization server standpoint? Do we have to do anything specific in the API Manager configuration?
So first you have to apply that in API Manager for resource level. And at the same time, I guess you have to apply the OAuth policy in your YAML file.
Yep, that's great. And you have to apply scopes as well to say this particular policy will be looking for this scopes. That's great.
So you could define that as enums in your YAML.
Yep. Okay, let's walk through that process on how do we set those up. So we go back to Okta authorization server and we create a group of users, right? Just for the demo purposes, I'm calling a group name as a select subscribers and premier subscribers. And I'm assigning users to each of these groups. If you notice here, for premier subscribers group, I have assigned a couple of users. Obviously, one of them is me and one of them is a fictitious user, Rob Smith. And in the select subscribers, I have assigned one user, John Grisham, just another fictitious user, just for the demonstration purposes and to see how these groups will work hand in hand later. And now we go into authorization server and also add scopes. So for example, I have created a premier level scope and select level scope. We go into each of these scopes that were created and assign access policies. So I'm saying select access, creating a select access policy with details of saying, okay, this scope is assigned to only select subscribers. And these are the scopes I will assign to them, right? So I'm creating the access policies within the authorization server. So in a larger organization, if we manage this by groups, it will be much easier rather than managing this by individual users, right? So for demo, I just created a select access and I assigned the select subscribers group here. And for premier access scope rule, I assigned the premier subscribers and I said, for the premier subscribers, I will assign the scope of select and premier level as well, because I want the read and write data to certain consumers. Now, how do we enforce this in our API manager? So same deal, we go into API manager policies and try to add a OpenID Connect access token enforcement policy. But instead of applying to all the API methods, we can pick and choose which one, which method and what is the URI that I want to apply my security policy on. In this case, I have selected get and I've written a regex saying anything customers, just assign them get access if the scope of the token is just this select level. You can obviously specify multiple scopes as well with space separated, but I'm just assigning one scope here for the demonstration purposes. And once that is set, I will apply. And since your policy is not applied to all the resources, you will still have the option to apply the same policy. When you go to apply new policy, your OpenID Connect policy will still show up. Now, in this policy, I'm saying my scope is a premier level, and the methods I'm selecting here is post, put, delete, and patch, right? And the template URI regular expression I'm using just the customer / blah, blah, blah. So anything customer / is going to be, this particular policy is going to be applied. So how does it look at the end? It's gonna look like this. So get will have this particular policy, post will have this particular policy, and if you hit the view detail or actions and edit, you will be able to see what are the details that we have provided in the earlier situation. Now, so same deal, how do we request the access to this client? These APIs, we just create a client application. And for demo purposes, I said, okay, this one, this app name is test OAuth app scopes. Okta, and we go into Okta and make sure that this particular application have our groups are assigned to this particular application. Right now, I'm saying this particular application, anyone in the select group and premier group can access this particular application. So if you go into, if you notice who are the users and premier subscribers and select subscribers group, we will use those for demonstration purposes in a bit. So now testing time of the read-only access scenario. Say if I'm getting the access token and I'm presenting the client ID and client secret of the application, but when it redirects to login page, I'm using the username, this particular username. If you see here, this is part of the select subscribers. So ideally, this guy should only have the access to the get endpoint of my API. Once the authorization is complete and the token is retrieved, if you do hit a get customers endpoint of your API, you will see the valid response because you're authorized. Your token that you have passed to API gateway introspects your token and sees that in the response list of scopes, in the introspection response JSON, you have a element with scopes, and allowed scopes are select level and any other scopes that are assigned to that, right? In this scenario, your allowed scopes were just the OpenID and select level. So now it said, okay, my access policy is allowing this, so I'm gonna let you access the get endpoint. But whereas when I try the post endpoint with the same exact token, since my token introspection response, in my token introspection response, my authorization server responded that I only have the select scope. So I'm not gonna let you hit my post endpoint. So authorization, your API manager gateway is going to stop allowing the access to your protected resource, which is post in this scenario. So how do we get access to post method? So let me, for example, in this scenario, my customer service department guy has logged in and he has generated the token using the same exact client application, same exact authorization URL, and everything is same. But when he is logging in as a customer service representative, and this particular username that we are using here is part of the premier subscribers group in your authorization server, right? So once you retrieve the token, send a request to your API and your token is part of your authorization header. Now Anypoint platform is going to, API gateway is going to pull out your token and introspect the token. Now your token will have introspection response of your token will have the scopes allowed as a select level and premier level, right? Since now if you do a get call against your customer's endpoint, you will still be able to access because select level was part of your access policy for this particular group. And when you do a post, you can still access that as well because you're part of the premier subscribers group, and in the token response, you have the scopes of premier level as well. So this is how we can control the granular access to each individual resources within the API up to the even methods, right? So if you have like a 10 or 20 different level of resources and one must be like highly secured to only certain users be able to call that APIs or whatnot, right? So you can control that with using the scopes. That's the end of the presentation. Any questions, or if any of you, I think we are already over time. I would have loved to show the Okta and Anypoint platform that I have shown you, that I have set it up as well. So let me use a quick 5 minutes. So this is the Okta screen that I'm logged into, just the developer account. You can set it up for, if you would like to test this out, you can just get a developer account, free developer account, and Anypoint platform trial account and try this out, right? So authorization servers, I have my authorization server here. I have my scopes defined. I have my access policies defined.
Class not meeting. Actually.
Can everyone go on mute, please? If you don't have any questions. So these are the access policies that I have defined, right? Same things that I've shown in the screenshot. And these are the scopes. And if you go to applications, you can see the applications that I have created for demonstration purposes. If you go into one of those, I've assigned the groups or whatnot. So same thing in, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so where exactly we configure, like a gate is allowed for a particular user and post is allowed? Is it in Okta or is it in any point?
So any point is what is, so in your API manager policy configuration is what is checking. So when you send a token to your API, right, in your call, so your API manager now have a policy that we have applied, right? So it has an OpenID Connect access token enforcement policy. It has a get with a scope of a select level, whereas for post, put, patch, you should be able to have the premier level. So when you send in a token, it sends a your gateway sends a introspection call to your authorization server, which responds with basic information whether the token is valid, but it also have the scopes element within the response of the token, and that's what this uses to validate.
Understood. Yeah, I have another question. So you mentioned the bearer token gets invalidated, let's say after 1 hour or 1 day, like whatever. So let's say I'm using this call in another MuleSoft API, HTTP request. So how do I renew that automatically? Like, is there a way we can do that?
So you can use the refresh policies as well, but as far as the Anypoint platform goes, so are you saying you'll be acting as a client or you'll be acting as a server in this scenario?
I'm acting as a client and I want to get new token, let's say every 1 hour or every 1 day.
Yeah, you can do caching. There is a few ways that you can do this. You can do caching of your token request call, and you can set your object stores time to live and expiry as well in order to control when to make an API call to get a token or when to use a cache token, right?
Oh, I see. So it's like a custom mechanism we need to build. There is no inbuilt mechanism from.
Yeah, if you're acting as a client, as far as I know, you would have to use a caching mechanism. But whereas your API manager, when you are applying a policies and you are acting as an API, in those scenarios, it is cached by default until the expiry of the app. But if you can customize the expiry of the token or when to get a new token in your properties as well, you can just specify a property in your runtime manager. For example, let me see if I have that in my demo. This is the property that you can put Anypoint platform, max federation expiration time. You can set it to whatever number, and the token will be refreshed for the period of time that is mentioned here. If this property is not mentioned, by default, it will keep the token until your I mean, it will not go for introspection of your token to authorization server for every call, and it will cache the token response until the token expires.
Okay, understood. Yeah, thank you.
So, Raghav, this makes sense for when a client's logging in. Is there a different, like, is this flow also applicable for like API to API calls where it's more of like a system account?
Yep, API to API call, we tend to use client credentials grant flow that I have mentioned earlier. So let me, so when we request an access and create an application, we go into authorization server and we make sure we check mark the client credentials grant type is allowed for this particular application. So when you do a token to your authorization server and get the access token instead of a twofold approach.
Right.
Like you are going and having them get the authorization code using the user credentials and then generate the.
And so even though MuleSoft doesn't allow you to check that box out of the box from the policy, it still supports the client credentials flow?
Yeah, it still supports, because all your clients will be your API will be doing is it is going into authorization server endpoint. It is presenting the credentials and getting it. So it is supported. It's not like, so authorization code is usually when a front end or something is involved where users can enter their credentials in order for that token to pass from experience to process to system. But if you want to do set a different type of authorization from system to process, you can still use client credentials, and you can register your process API as a client application.
Hey, Raghav,
Yep.
you're 20 minutes over, so we should probably hold off on questions to give others the opportunity to present their content, and we can ask more questions at the end.
Sure, awesome. Thanks, guys. I'll try to get to the questions later. I can hang on after the presentations are done if anyone else have further questions.
And feel free, the chat is there, so if you have questions for Raghav as well during the other presentations, feel free to go ahead and ask them there, and Raghav will monitor those and answer as necessary. Thank you again. We appreciate it. If you can go ahead and stop sharing, not sure if you did already. And
thanks everyone for listening in. And if it is too boring, I'm sorry. I already had 2 beers.
Excellent content,
good
sir.
content. Appreciate it, man. All right, so this is Mike Loos. I am again going to share. I have my surprise tip. Hopefully people find value in this. We'll give it a moment here. All right, so first of all, can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
All right. So my surprise tip is the lookup function and performance around the lookup function in Dataweave. So if anybody has ever used that, I'm going to talk about how to make your lookup functions perform much better than they probably have in the past. So first of all, what is a lookup function? Well, in Dataweave, you might want the opportunity to do a cross-reference against data that's external to the transformation to say, hey, you know what? I've got this zip code. Give me the valid city and state for that zip code, and I want to fill that into my transform. You would use a function called lookup in Mule to do that. However, depending upon how you implement that, you might have terrible performance, or you could have really good performance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through 3 different things that help to improve performance that we see in Dataweave when you're doing the lookup function. The first one is using local variables in your Dataweave function, which I'll show. The second one is caching your lookup results. Why go back to the backend system every single time to ask for very similar or same data? And the third one is the most important of the 3. This is when you are doing a lookup and you're doing a match against the retrieved data, you want to look up against a hash map by key versus doing a match against looping through all of the destination values that you're going against. I will show you what this means, but this is going to be hopefully a valuable tip for those. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my presentation. I'm going to switch over to Studio. And with that, first off, is everybody able to see Studio here?
Yes.
All right, perfect. I am going to show you the first transform, and then I'm going to show you the difference in the 3 different types to be able to show you that. So first of all, I'm going to do a transform here where I would like to do a lookup, and I'm going to maximize that for folks to be able to see here. So let's assume I have zip code data coming in, right? Coming in on the left, and I need to look up against an external system for the city and state against that zip code, right? So there is a function here, and I'm going to talk through the syntax in a moment, but there's a function called lookup, right? And what this does, it says, go to the flow, look up each. So it's going to look in the Mule project for a flow called lookup each. It's going to pass in the second parameter, which is the current zip code. And then whatever it replies back with will be set to this value. And then I can use it within my transform. This third parameter says, hey, should I time out if I'm making that lookup call so that I don't end up timing out the client? So you can basically trap an error saying that, hey, if it took longer than 10 seconds, I want to trap that and then be able to send that back. So in this case, because I've set a variable to found zip data, it will, of course, here's my zip code that came in. I can now do found zip data.city, found zip data.state. Now I'll explain why I did it that way, but the whole purpose here is really, the first piece is thinking about this function called lookup being of key value for being able to go up and get data that exists somewhere else during the transform. So if I minimize that, I'm going to go to the flow called lookup each. So if you remember, I said, hey, go to flow called lookup each here, and then execute that flow. The inbound payload of lookup flow is that second parameter here again. So what I'm doing simply in this case is I'm logging that. I'm in the lookup each. I'm setting times because I want to be able to say, look, I want to show you the performance of all of these different options. So I'm gonna store a variable of the current begin time in milliseconds. In this case, I'm going to select from a database table. So give me all of the zip codes where zip code equals that zip code that got passed in. In this case, the payload will be equal to that zip code. And then I'm going to transform my reply. And so this is the important piece here, right? Notice how my reply is replying back both city and state data as a Java object. So I'll receive a Java object back from this with the city and the state. I'm then setting my end time variable, and I am then logging that variable data, right? So time it took querying, end time minus begin time in milliseconds, right? So this kind of shows how long this would take. So if I go back to my transform message here again, and I look at that, there's a reason why I did this. If you've ever heard of the scope in Dataweave 2 called do, it's very similar to something that was called using in Dataweave 1. Do not do using anymore. You basically can create a variable scope by wrapping your section, your segment in a do scope, right? Which is that right there. And then you can create a set of variables that will now go and look up and it'll reply back. And so now I have found zip data, which will return both the city and the state. And I can use that within each loop response twice instead of doing something like this. So let's assume I needed to do both of these again. I could do city 2 and I could go and do copy and paste this lookup. I'm going to grab this lookup here, right? And paste that there. If I did that right, paste. And I must not have copied properly. Let's try that again. Copy. And I can paste this here, right? And then because that returns an object, I can then wrap it in a parenthesis and I can say .city. And I could do that again for the state. However, if I do it this way, it's going to make up lookup twice for each looped iteration, right? And so the key here is, since I know I need 2 sets of data, I should return both sets of data from that lookup, and I should store it as a variable so each loop only makes 1 call versus making multiple calls, which is why I did. And that's that whole local variable scope. So that's the first tip. All right, so we understand this. And what I'm doing here is I'm just checking in my input type, if the loop type equals each, I want you to basically make a SQL query for each one of these zip codes and get the data back. We understand this isn't going to be very fast, but I want to show you again the difference between doing it like this versus what might be a better option. The second option I have is if you send the loop type equal to, actually I'm going to do that one third. If you send no value or value is no good, I'm actually going to do a loop, and I'll show you what I mean here. So I'm doing the same thing I did earlier. Everything's exactly the same, except for I'm doing a flow called lookup loop, and I'm going to show you lookup loop. And a lot of people do what I'm about to show you, and this is actually not faster than making individual SQL queries, but it's not well known that. So I'm going to show you this. So I've got this other flow called lookup loop, right? And so if you look at it, there's the same thing happening. I am logging, hey, in lookup from loop. I'm actually setting a constant in this case of array for my cache because I want to cache all the results. I'm setting the zip code as the inbound. So here's my zip code payload. And then I'm caching, going out and I'm getting, so this is doing a flow reference. If I look at that, go get all records. So I've got a flow here called go get all records, which queries every single record. So I'm pulling in all the zip code data into a cache so that I can pull it from cache versus querying the database every time. So it will take a long time the first time because I'm going and pulling those records into memory, but at least it's doing it one time, right? And so if I look at the transform results, I'm just simply getting the zip code data that I'm interested in, storing that, and then if I go back to my lookup loop flow, it's going to cache the results. I'm just replying, hey, by the way, you didn't serve from cache, right? Because it's the first time I called it, and I'm storing that. So now I'm going to do my transform on that. So I'm going to set my begin time, and I'm going to do what we typically see folks do, which is taking and looping through each record in that response to be able to find the data. And you don't really realize that's happening. So I'm going to show you that. So I created a variable called record that's going to filter the entire record set, which is all of the zip codes. And I'm going to match where the zip code equals my variable that I brought in for. That's going to then return a record. And now I can say the first result of that, which should only be one, .city, the second result, or the first result, which is .state. So this filter query, which is a very common way people do this matching filter, actually loops through every single record. It doesn't stop when it finds it. It will legitimately go through all, I believe, and I'm going to show you this, 42,000, right? So if I select all of my zip codes here from my database table, 42,000. So every time you query, it's going to do 42,000 loops, right? Which, if you have a large record set, might take too long. So, but I'm going to show you this. So that's the filter. So this will loop through and find the one record. And once it finds it, it'll still go through the rest of them, but it'll only return one record. And then in that case, that's why I can do record 0. So this will be matching from data coming from a cache versus going and querying the database directly, setting the end time and logging. Okay, so that's the second option. The third option I wanted to show you, which is by far the fastest, is if you pass a var loop type of hash map. Okay, and so this is just me doing a choice which one I do. I'm going to look at this transform. It's the same as all the other ones we looked at. The difference is I'm calling the flow called lookup hash map. So let's go to the lookup hash map and let's look how that works and why, and we'll see ultimately as I run it, this is much faster. Same thing, logging saying, hey, in lookup from hash map, I'm setting a constant for my cache that this is the hash map key I want you to store. My zip code is going to be the same here, which is my payload that came in. And then I'm calling the flow reference, which is the same one as before, which says, go get all the records. So I'm still going to get all the records and I'm going to store it. But the difference is converting the data to a hash map that then I can query against versus just a big array. So you'll see what I do here. So ultimately, I'm creating a top level object type called data, right? And within it, I'm looping through every record and I'm setting the key of the record to be the zip code and the value to be the entire zip code record. So that this will allow me to look up this record in that collection, which is really a map, by the zip code itself. And so I can return it via memory lookups in Java versus actually doing a full loop of every single one of them and returning it back. So there's, and then I'm storing that in the cache. And so if I go back here, and again, same thing, I'm saying, hey, not first serve from cache. And then I'm showing storing the begin time, storing the end time, logging it. And here's the lookup, right? So this is where the performance comes. So in this case, if you remember in the loop, I was doing creating a variable called record where I did a filter which looped through every record. All I'm doing now is payload.data, give me the name of the zip code. And so this will actually obtain the value by the hash map key, which is a memory-based lookup, extremely efficient and much more quick than doing a loop through every single one. And now it's record.c, record.state, okay? So those are the three ways I'm doing it. Again, querying every single record, looping every record and matching, and then looking up for each by hash map. Let's go ahead and start this up. And I'm gonna, and this is a live demo here. I'm gonna run this project and we'll let this start. It's gonna take a moment. While that happens, let's again go back to my database here because the database I'm looking at. So we've got a bunch of, this is literally every zip code in the United States. I just downloaded this data from the US Postal Service. They publish it and I put it into a database, which is what I'm gonna be using. And of course, as we remember before, there was, I believe, 42,000 records. Yep, 42,500 records that are out there. Okay. My Postman query is going to start out with doing an each. All right. So the first two people that put in a valid US zip code, I'm going to use because we're not going to show this as live. So go into the chat, put in a valid zip code, and I'm going to pull up the chat. First two people. And for some reason, I'm having problems seeing the chat right now. There it is. Anybody put one in? Hey, there we are. All right, I got two. So the first one is 30005, right? Was that correct? And the second one was 0245. So let's grab that one. Okay. So those are the two I'm going to use. Let's go back, make sure my server is running up. Of course, I got the, hey, not a lot of memory available. Hopefully you can start again. Try it again. Give that a moment. I believe I might have to, if this doesn't start successfully the second time, you might have to stop something. Maybe stop my PowerPoint or something along those lines. Ooh, might be good. Wait for it. There we go. Perfect. Starting this time. All right, we'll give that a second. Shouldn't take too long.
Mike, while that's loading, I noticed in the hash map you were referencing vars.zip code.
Yep.
Is that just because you saved that in a var like called zip code, or was that some more magical?
Nope, simple as that. Set zip code,
Yeah.
right? Zip code, vars.zip
Oh,
code.
so that was the original payload. I gotcha.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. So I should be running here. Okay, well, almost there. The joy of having 45 things running and studio, if anybody's ever seen this before, right? Almost there. Okay, we're deployed. Okay, well, let's make sure that's maximized again so we can read it properly. Uh-oh, the joy, I closed my window. Let's open my console again. There we go. All right, so we got that full screen. I'm gonna do the each, right? So it should go and actually go to the database for both of these. Hope for the best, let's run it. It's doing a lookup. There we go. Okay, are those two right, by the way? Alpharetta, Georgia, and Waltham, Massachusetts. Yes, I heard a yes. So there we go. Okay, so first of all, my stuff worked, which is great. We like that. Let's go look at some timings here, okay? So you notice it took a little bit of time there, 735 milliseconds, 103 milliseconds. What I'm gonna do is, by the way, it had to go out to the database, cache some of the connection, things like that. I'm gonna run it a couple of times just so that now it's warm. So we'll run it 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, okay? And if we remember, it should have gone to the database every single time, and we can look at that timing. So notice we're getting about 63, 120, 90. So what, between 60 and 100 roughly is what we're getting average, okay, for that run. I'm gonna go ahead and clear that quickly, and we're gonna do the same thing. And we're gonna change this now to do loop. So if you remember, it was between 60 to 140 total. So I'm switching this to loop. We're gonna run it again. Now it's gotta go the first time, go pull all of that data into memory. So it's gonna take a moment for the first one. So we're gonna let that happen, right? There we go. Okay, still came back, so it worked. Let's go ahead and do 3 more. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so now serve from cache. So I'm gonna go ahead and you'll see my logs, right? You see the first time it said, whoa, 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 not served from cache. So the first time I had to go out and it did 543 milliseconds. And then you started to see, okay, some faster times, some slower times, which is actually quite interesting. But this was slower. But the point is this, if your database is quick and you're on a fast network, this isn't really all that faster consistently, right? It's very interesting to look at that. So sometimes it took longer, sometimes it was less, and sometimes a lot less. But again, the point is it's not necessarily faster to go that route. So I'm gonna leave this. We're gonna clear it one more time here, and we're gonna switch that over to doing the hash map based lookup. So I'm gonna switch this to hash map. The first time it's gonna have to go to the database, pull in all of the data, and you're gonna see an interesting bit of data. Okay, so I've got the first one. Let's do 3 more. 1, 2, 3, right? And I'm gonna show the data over here. Very interesting. First time, 17 milliseconds, 1, 3, 5, 4, 3, 2, 4. It's extremely consistent at a much drastically, sometimes 30 to 40x faster rate in looking up via hash map. And to prove again, this is not smoke and mirrors, we'll one more time change this. Let's say we change this first one here to one that was in the chat, 55343. Oh, looks like there's a second one that came in. Great. So 07054, right? We'll run this first with each, right? We'll do 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, real data came back, Eden Prairie and Parsippany, right? And so there's some data there. So 89, 52, 83, 128. So we see that data. Let's switch it to loop again. 1, 2, 3. Look at that data. And look, notice it actually took longer in some instances, shorter in some instances. So really not necessarily faster doing that. And then let's switch to hash map one more time. 1, 2, 3. And then the values, notice, very, very light, right? So that's my tip. This is my big tip of the day, is use lookups to be able to do that. but secondarily, ensure that your data is stored in cache as much as possible, and look it up via hash map keys versus loops with the filter command. With that, I'm going to pause. Any quick questions on that?
How will we handle cache misses, Mike?
Well, so with cache misses, you'll just deal the same way you normally would. Identifying my hash in my hash map, and then you can decide what you do in the UI. I chose to just say, look, they're real, right? It would error out right now because I'm not trapping the error. But typically, you are going to trap the error and do something interesting, either return like no data found, or but that's something that you can choose to do in your subflow. Answer your question?
Yeah.
I got a request from the chat. Hiren, can I share the code? I absolutely will. I'm going to put my email specifically out here. And if anyone, oops, I'm going to do everyone in meeting. If you would like me to share this code with you, I will. So I'm just putting my email address out in the chat. So feel free to do that. And I will offline send you this code. But of course, this recording is being saved. And will be put out to the Meetup site. But if you're interested in the code itself, I'll do that. Any other questions? There was a question. Is it better to place hard-coded zip city state values in the Dataweave Excel instead of the database? Actually, no. The speed is going to be exactly the same as what I showed you, except for the first call, right? So the first call has to go and cache the data. That's going to take time. But by putting the hard-coded city-state zip, those ultimately end up in memory as well. It's not going to be any faster on a continued runtime, and it's just going to be a lot of copying and pasting into your Dataweave. Any other questions at this point? Otherwise, what we'll do is we'll turn it over to Mark, because I believe Mark is next, and he's going to show us some. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Mike. Sorry to interrupt. Quick suggestion, not really a question. So lookup can be bad when used in certain scenarios, and it can be great in certain scenarios, right? What are some thumb rules when we shouldn't be using lookup?
Well, so if you cannot, as an example, go get, store the data within the flow that you need to be able to do cross-referencing, you got to use a lookup. If it's possible to bring it in, yeah, there's some value in doing that. And when it comes down to it, it's all about concurrency, right? So if you have thousands of requests per second on this thing, you're going to end up with a scenario where flow to flow to flow calls within Mule causes subcontexts in Mule, and there is a hard limit of the amount of subcontexts that are available within the Mule runtime. It's very, very hard to hit that number. I mean, you literally have to be doing thousands of requests per second, which in most scenarios, most APIs are not individually, and so therefore it's not as big of a deal. But it could be a problem if you were doing that type of volume, and so you might at that point not want to do this flow, call, flow within a lookup and try to do it within the same flow itself.
Yep. And if someone were to use a lookup function in order to call a flow, which is internally calling database every time rather than fetching the database set and keeping it in a variable to cache. So any tips there?
Obviously, make sure that your query lookup is against an indexed field within the database to try to improve that performance. And obviously ensuring that the database is as close to Mule as possible, because if the database is, let's say, running on Amazon and Mule is running on Azure or running on premise, you're going to be making that performance hit of the network for each round trip back and forth. So try ensuring that your database and your Mule runtime are as close as possible from a networking perspective.
Yep. Thanks. Absolutely. Since the moving of Dataweave processing into CPU intensive threads, right? We have seen some issues in scenarios where Mule lookups was used, but not the right fit. And we saw issues, blowing up issues as soon as we started migrating to 4.2, because now your intensive threads are limited, right? I think that tips definitely will help. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Raghav. So by the way, just from a time perspective, we're going to pause this. If you have more questions, put them in the chat, or we'll save them for the end. And I am going to stop sharing and turn it over to Mark, who is going to show us Deploying to Runtime Fabric. Mark, take it away.
I will take it away when I can find the share button. That's not share. Let me know when you see my screen, please.
Yes.
Well, that's not the screen I thought you were going to see. Give me a second. All right, hopefully that looks better. All right, so my name is Mark Kirby, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about RTF and deployment with Maven. Now, last time I spoke about CI/CD kind of in a holistic sense, particularly focused on Azure DevOps and how that could work. I had the opportunity, since I working on an RTF project, to see some uniqueness about working with RTF in particular and doing deployments with Maven that I thought would be helpful if I brought that to this community. So I'm going to move fairly quickly. We won't bother on the agenda. I'm Mark. This is me holding the walleye up north 2 days ago. I'm a practice lead out of Infinite Resource Solutions. I've been in IT for a bit over 25 years, and I'm very much fixated on the integration space and have been for a very long time. I'm MCD and MCI. Particularly when we look at RTF, it's a new and very compelling choice from a hosting perspective. It has a lot of awesome things that I'm not going to dig into in this presentation, but there's some trade-offs to it that are a little bit tricky, right? So first off, we're going to talk about the deployment today. There's also some things that make it a little bit harder to work with because you don't have the toys as easily as accessible. So when you think about running in your IDE, you can just spin up an instance of MuleSoft that runs associated with your IDE and you can test a bunch of stuff. Or you can download it from MuleSoft and literally just install it locally and run it as a standalone application or as a naked Mule. Or you can just create a new account and you automatically get access to some space inside a Cloud Hub. In the case of RTF, it's a little bit different because you don't just get to set up an RTF environment. So it's a little bit tricky to have that experience walking into those new projects without having a chance to play with it, which is the situation I found myself in a couple months ago. And that's part of the reason that I wanted to come talk today is the way that deployment works is a little bit different. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more in a moment. But the key here, the fundamental difference is that unlike Cloud Hub and on-premise, where you can kind of deploy your binary from your back pocket, however magic you want to do it, in the case of deploying to RTF instances, you're actually deploying your binary implementation from Anypoint Exchange's Maven repository. And once you publish a version, it's immutable. And I'm going to say that with an asterisk next to it, but for our conversation, we're going to say that it's immutable. You can actually change it within the first week, but that's a little bit more esoteric that we want to go today. Our goal here is to establish that predictability, that confidence in the deployment process, and to automate as highly as possible, you know, the movement of code from our development environment through our version control into our controlled dev, UAT, prod, what have you. So before we dig into the actual example and how it works differently, let's take a moment and kind of talk about how that works, right? So when you think about Mule standalone, you know, when you're running Mule on your local machine or in an environment, it kind of has a Tomcat feel. If you felt like just dropping that jar into the file system directly, it'll automatically pick it up and spin it up and do all the things that it does with that. You can also go through the Runtime Manager, or you can use the APIs, or you can use the Maven plugin, which operates against the APIs. That gives you kind of direct control over that binary that gets put there. And there's a reason that I keep banging on that. That binary that you put there, you can change it at your leisure without versioning it. Meaning that I can have 1.1.1 that I change a little bit, I change whatever I want, and I can still deploy it as 1.1.1. Moving into the next space in Cloud Hub, it's a very similar experience, but you don't have access to the file system. And since you don't have access to the file system, that means that you're not going to be able to just do the direct deployment the same kind of way. So Cloud Hub works a little bit differently, but you're still attaching your binary to that experience. In the case of Runtime Fabric, you have the Runtime Manager to do APIs, you can drive it through. And in this demonstration, we're going to go through that Maven plugin to see that. In this case, there's 3 steps instead of 2. So when we think about Naked Mule or Cloud Hub, you implement, you sit on your desktop, you use Anypoint Studio, you create that Mule project. And that Mule project, you're able to exercise and establish that feel that you want to get. Whenever you feel like building it, you just tell it to build, and it's going to execute that Maven command per your IDE configuration, and we'll look at where that is. And it's going to create that deployable archive, and then you can push it to your target environment at your leisure or your convenience. When we look at Runtime Fabric, there's an additional step here, and that step locks you into a particular version. So you can implement, same as we implemented before. You can build that deployable same way we built it before, and we're going to exercise that from the command line in a little bit. But now you have this additional step where you're pushing this deployment directly into the Exchange repository. So there's a Maven Exchange repository, and we're going to see where that is and how you access that shortly. Once that gets there, you can pass in parameters, but you don't get to change that binary. And we're going to see a couple different ways we can approach that. And then there's the deployment to the target environment. And this deployment is actually not sourcing from your binary. Let me see if I can bring up the chat. Chat. Somebody sent a chat and I can't see it. So let me see if I can adjust my screen a little bit. Mike, if it's something I need to respond to, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to drive on.
Hey, Mark, go ahead. I'm just driving in some check-ins. I will call out if there is any questions.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So when we do a deployment to a target environment, it's actually not taking this binary, and we're going to see that in some of our exercises shortly. It's actually taking the binary that's deployed to the Exchange Maven repo. So that has some implications when you think about that. And we're going to work through a couple of different examples. Now, there's 3 basic commands that we're going to need in order to make this go, right? So we're going to tell it to do a package. So we're just going to do a build, and we're going to do it from the command line and kind of see what that experience is like. We're then going to use a deployment. So this builds the project, and you've been working with this for a long time, right? So whenever you hit go and you see that Maven syntax in your console, this is really just running that package, or maybe a clean package. Maybe it's telling it to skip the unit test, maybe it's not. But we'll see where that's configured and kind of see what that looks like. Now we're going to use a Maven deploy. Now this deploy is actually pushing the binary that's being created or that's available to it and placing that in the repository. And you can only run this once per version. If you try to run it again, you'll get an error, and we're going to experience that and see what that's like. And we'll also notice that when we run both of these commands, we're not going to provide it any properties. It's going to get all of its intelligence from the POM file and from the mavens.settings. And so that's taking that security information from the Maven settings that tells it where to put it. Finally, we're going to need to do a Maven deploy, and we're going to use a -d mule deploy. And if we try to do this out of sequence, this is going to fail because it's not going to be able to source it from there. Now, in this case, we're going to actually pass in some parameters to that. That's going to provide the credentials that have deployment capabilities to that RTF environment. So those are the 3 commands. Let's get out of full screen for a second. I want to now hop into the actual IDE for a bit. So we're going to start out with our Hello World application. Now, our Hello World application doesn't do anything super interesting, right? All we're doing is setting the payload, and we're logging a message, and that's kind of it. But the moral of the story here is really the POM, and we're going to look at 2 POMs. First, we're going to look at I'll say the default POM. When you get the default POM, this is going to establish a couple of different things, right? Particularly, it starts out assuming that the group ID is going to be based on your company's presence on the internet or something along those lines. When we do RTF deployment with Maven, we got to change that and replace that with our organization ID for MuleSoft. And we'll see an example of that shortly. Scrolling down, we're going to add a bunch more properties because when we look at the Anypoint experience for RTF deployment, there's a bunch more things that we have to tell it, particularly around capacity. What can it take for CPU and memory? And we're going to look at the variables that are available for that. Also, when we get down to this configuration, we're going to actually have to provide it a lot of configuration detail that speaks to the specifics for the Runtime Fabric environment that we're targeting. The rest of this, we get down, we're going to have to add an additional distribution repository, and we're going to see what that looks like. So this is the default. If you created a plain Jane project that didn't do anything, which is what I did here, this is the pre-default POM file. I'm going to go ahead and close that because we've seen it enough. We're going to go ahead and drive into the POM. Now, in this case, we changed a bunch of things and we added some things. And it makes a little bit of sense if you think about it, right? So we're going to set the CPU reserve and the CPU maximum. So this is minimum CPU consumption, and this is what it's going to take if it's got capacity within your core allocations to spin up when it needs more resources. Same with memory. This is going to be the minimum amount of memory, and this is going to be what it can surge to acquire. Interestingly enough, this is not in the Runtime Manager when you see that experience, so I'll just leave it at that. Finally, we get to set the number of replicas, and replicas is similar but different to what workers are when you think about it in Cloud Hub. I'll leave the deeper RTF conversations for someone else to bring up later. For now, I'm just going to drive forward for sake of time. As I said before, we're going to have to define fairly sharply what this Runtime Fabric deployment looks like. And by the way, if I didn't provide it already, when I get done talking and have a moment, I'll paste in the chat the link that has both this presentation in its entirety as well as an example POM. Because my goal is that with the example POM and going through the deck, you should be able to get a project up and working in 15 minutes instead of the amount of time it took me to set it up the first time. So here's where we're capitalizing on all those variables, right? So we're establishing our reserves, we're establishing a replica count. We're also, when it comes to deployment, we're passing in client ID, client secret information. This is really going to be what organization am I deploying it to? What's their client ID, client secret? So how am I pushing that out and getting that forward? If I'm actually doing a deployment, I also need to provide it a MuleSoft user or someone with authority from an Anypoint control plane perspectives information to allow it to be deployed at all, right? You got to be a sufficient user to be able to do that. And we're going to see that as we go forward. Now, in this case, I'm passing in some of these parameters and some of these I'm hard coding into my property section. So some, they're going to be the same. So when you think about doing deployments at for an application, I just cooked them directly into my properties. For others, because as I go through different environments, I may want those to be different. This gives you an opportunity to kind of see what that experience is kind of like. So in this case, I hard-coded my client ID, my client secret. I went ahead and captured my group ID. So all of these are associated to the organization/business group. Once I've established those, then I'm able to leverage those further on down my POM to establish here's the parameters around my Runtime Fabric deployment. Now there's one more thing that I want to call out here, and that's this section right here, distribution management. This is where we're telling it where the repository is. Now when we do a deploy, it's going to attempt to use this particular reference, and this needs to match exactly what's in your settings.xml of whatever your build/deployment environment is. If you don't match it, you don't provide credentials for it, you're going to have to either provide them here or you're going to have problems executing your POM. Now, I know I talked super fast through that. I know we're running long. I'm going to go ahead and drop to the command line and let's run a few commands and kind of see how that goes. So I'm currently in the directory that has the project, right? So let's just do a dir so we can see that our POM is in fact there, and this is our simple hello world project. If we just want to package this up to build it, all we have to do is run, if I could only type, nbn.package. Now it's going to go through and do its magic thing and say, all right, I have successfully built this jar. All right, so that's good. We like that. Now, before we show a cured patient, let's hop into any point. So inside of our control plane, inside of our sandbox environment, we currently have nothing running. If we try to call the particular endpoint out there and we make a reference out to that, we see that that application is not deployed. There's nothing listening there. The next command we need to do is going to be Maven deploy. And what this is going to do is it's going to take, based on what's in the POM file and based on what's in my settings.xml, it's going to push that 1.0.7 out into the deployment. And we can see that as it copies this out here, it's reading this out to us. Now, the first thing that you should know, let's say I try to do that again with the same POM, the same version. Let's run it again. Now it's going to complain because this already exists. It's not going to be able to take that same version forward again. So you're basically trying to do a deploy to something that's already deployed. So now that we know that we can build it, we know that we pushed it out there, we exercised that, we proved that if we try to run that deploy on the same version multiple times, we were going to have a problem. Let's go ahead and push that out. Now notice I'm passing in deploy. My environment's going to be the sandbox, so I'm telling it specifically where I want to put it. And the reason that I externalize all these properties is because they may change when I go to different environments. So if I want to go to a different environment, I can just change the name to dev, or I can change the name to prod, or what have you. Now in this case, I'm using a temporary user that I'll disable as soon as we get done with this presentation. But for now, this user is going to be able to make deployments. I'm using a simple password. I'm targeting that demo-rtf environment, and I'm giving it that -d mule deploy. So now when we go back to the Runtime Manager, we're in the sandbox environment, we're going to see that we've got hello world out there trying to start up. We click on that, or we want to go into the details, we can see the details as they get processed. It'll take about 2 minutes to start. Now there's a couple of things that we can see here. One is we can see what we've set for our environment. Two, we can see what our minimum memory reserve is going to be. So what's our memory reserve going to be? After this comes up, I'm going to have to make one change that's off script, but we're going to let it finish coming up before I'll make that change. All right, so our application started. Just to make sure that it started, we're going to go out there and call it no listener. Here's where I'm going to make that modification. So if I go to my ingress, because of the way we set up our particular instance, once you set that up for a normal RTF environment, you're never going to have to do this. While that's spinning that up, let's go back to our console for a second.
Mark, you beat it. You like changed the configuration, started redeploying before it was able to check whether it was completed or not.
You know, I get excited. I start pushing stuff around. All right, hopefully it'll pick up the started state now and won't get too huffy about it.
Your replica started if you want to show running.
So again, this doesn't do very much, but my replica started. I've corrected my ingress. Now that my ingress is straight, I'm able to call hello world simple test function. You know, this doesn't seem like a lot in and of itself, but when it comes right down to it, that's a crucial step in getting to that automated place that you want to get with all of your deployments, right? When you're doing RTF, you want to make this an automated dream. I'm going to give this just a minute longer, and then I'm going to decide it's done and kill it. All right, so we've gone ahead and we've ran this. There's a couple of things that we should see. One is if I try to do a deployment again, can I deploy the same application again? And I'm going to break the password just because we want to see some of the errors that we can see. Yep, it's giving me a fairly concise error message here saying 401, you're not authorized because I broke the password. Another one that you can do is if you're trying to deploy the same named application, which if you're going to a different cluster, you can deploy the same name application because it's isolated in namespace by the name of the cluster. In this case, because of how we're doing it here, it's going to have a conflict and it's going to come up with a different error. Now, at first, it's not going to tell you a lot because that would take all the fun out of it, right? It's actually going to tell us exactly what we need to know, which is going to be, couldn't do it, make sure there's not another application under the same name in a different environment, but within the cluster. And that's the magic conflict there. Now let's come back, and just because I have a sense of humor, let's try making some changes in Anypoint Studio. Inside of Anypoint Studio, if we go back here and we say, hello world, I don't want to talk to the world. Twin Cities, hello Twin Cities. And we're going to go ahead and save that change. Builds correctly, right? I can build it. If we hop into the control plane, we should see that it's going to refresh. I'm trying to create a new correct state.
Hey, Mark.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So before, meanwhile, this is getting deployed, can I ask a very simple question?
Absolutely.
So when you say MVN deploy on command prompt, how does it take to the Anypoint like console? Like where does this setting work? Is it in settings.xml?
Yes. So the settings.xml is a feature of Maven where you can enter a bunch of different configuration information, right? So let me see if I can find one that I can put on the screen without that being a problem. All right, so that came up. Give me one more second. So here's an example of what comes in the original, right? In the original, you really don't have any server sections. but it's got the syntax for it if you look at this file in detail. So wherever you keep your settings.xml file in relation to it. Now, as I said in my previous presentation, right? If you're on a development team, you work in version control, you've got a build server someplace, whatever that build server is using for its settings.xml, you have to match that name. Particularly hopping back into the IDE, the name of that server has to explicitly match what's in your POM file. So in this case, I matched maven.anypoint.MuleSoft as being my primary. The other thing here is that this has to be your organization's org ID. If those two things aren't correct, you're not going to be able to do a deployment. You're going to get a 401 or a 409 error when you try to do it, particularly on the deploy command. And we'll talk a little bit about troubleshooting when I return to the deck.
I see, yeah. Thank you.
All right, so my application came up. I'm going to go ahead and run this again. And you'll notice that it didn't change, which is exactly what we would expect to have happen if we didn't know knowing what we know now. If we didn't know that, we'd be confused about why that happened. Why didn't that do better? And the short answer is because we couldn't, if we tried to run the deploy, so let's go ahead and find our console and let's run that deploy again. So if I try to run this deploy, it's going to come back, it's going to try to do its thing, and then it's going to be mad. It's going to be mad because it already exists, and it's going to give me that 409 error. So my hope in grinding this home is to say, this is the experience you'll have if you hadn't seen this document or this presentation to clear the path for you. Just to run full circle and get the demo to completion, I'm going to go ahead and just reversion this. I'm going to change it to a 1.08. I'm going to save that. I'm going to hop back into my console for a second. I'm going to repackage it. I'm going to deploy it. This is going to put it into the repository. And now I'm going to deploy it to my environment. Once this deployment completes, then we're going to see our message correctly. While that's completing its process, I'm trying to think if there's anything else we want to cover on this. The POM file is out there. I'm going to send everybody a link that's going to take them here, and this is going to bring them to the presentation. The presentation's got a little bit more text to it. We're going to hop back into it in just a moment.
Looks to be running there.
Looks to be running. Are you going to catch it up this time? Because I know I'm super impatient. And now we have Hello Twin Cities. So it pretty much acts the way we would have hoped it would act based on the conversation that we've had so far. Let's hop back to the presentation. We talked briefly about this. Because of time, you're certainly welcome to go back and do that. I went ahead and did the demo. There's a couple of things that jumped out at me when I was first going through this. Now, first off, if you want a much more verbose response from Maven, give it the -X. The -X is going to clear the path of the righteous. If you get a 401 on the deploy, you either have a problem with your credentials or there's something not right with your settings.xml. If you get a 401 on your deploy-d mule deploy, it means your user is either incorrect or does not have the authority to execute the deployment on the control plane. If you try to replace or override an existing version, you'll get a 409, and that's all I'll say about that. What I learned from this process, what I suggest you take away from it is, first off, don't overthink your build process. You should have a predictable CI/CD. I've been at several organizations that had like 2 MuleSoft developers, and yet they were establishing CI/CD for a staff of 50 that were all going to be working on the same thing at the same time. Make sure that it's thorough and that it covers, that you have traceability and all the things that you need, but I would say only make the process as complicated as it needs to be for your event horizon. Second, parameterize your POMs. I provided a POM template that I'll make sure everyone has a link to when I get done with this presentation. That's able to download. You can start with that as a basis and modify that to get to where you need to go. That should shorten your journey, which is, my whole goal here was to shorten your journey to being able to effectively deploy that via scripts and or CI/CD. Build once and deploy many, because to me, I see a lot of folks that are doing separate builds for test and what have you. I would discourage that. You might want to think about doing that differently as you go forward. Always, always, always use version control. RTF, by the way, because you have a namespace differentiator in the name of your cluster, you can deploy the same name application to multiple clusters. From here, you're going to want to look at your CI/CD process if RTF's in your future. You're going to want to make sure that you adjust that to accommodate the modifications that are needed to support the RTF if that's where you're going. I would further suggest that you might want to look at a hybrid approach for deployment strategy, meaning that maybe you want to have a dev instance that's a shared instance that's either Cloud Hub or on-premise that allows you a bit more casual approach to building your applications, and not until you actually have them reasonably perfected would you push them out into those higher environments. I know I talked super fast. I couldn't see any of the chat. If there's any questions that you have, reach out in the chat, reach out to me afterwards. I will put the link to get to the material in just one moment in the chat.
Thank you, Mark. All right. We are a little over time, but we're going to give it to Julian to be able to show the Dataweave tips as well. So Julian?
Good. You guys hear me all right?
Yes. Thank you, sir.
Okay. So I'm going to show you guys, first off, my name's Julian. I'm a consultant at Concord and a Mule developer. So I am going to show you how to set up a Dataweave playground. So that's just going to be, it's going to be an environment where you can run Dataweave scripts on test data, and you'll be able to define whatever data you want in your inputs, and the output's going to be updated every time you change your script. So this is actually all laid out in the MuleSoft documentation. So I'll put a link to that in the chat as well once I'm done here. But it's really straightforward. So the benefits would be if you are a beginner with Dataweave, it's going to let you play around a little bit and make sure you've got the syntax right without having to redeploy the application and hit the endpoint and find the errors that way. If you've got a little bit more experience with Dataweave, this method of writing scripts, for me anyways, it helps me keep everything straight when I'm chaining functions together. MuleSoft, Dataweave comes with a lot of really helpful functions to do most of anything that you'd want to do without having to necessarily write too many of your own functions with sort of by creating a more complicated function out of the base core functions that come with Dataweave. But sometimes people fall into that, I think, because they're not exactly sure what the outputs and of each of the functions are going to be. So if you sort of build it step by step using a Dataweave playground, it can help you be more efficient, I think. So all you really need is a transform message, but we're going to go ahead and create a new project here for this. So once I've got my project here, the first step is that we need to define our input data. And the input data, so in this example, I'm a farmer and I want to determine how much wool I'm going to get from each of my sheep. So I've got some data on my sheep here. You're going to want to create your input data file in the source main resources folder. I've just got an array, which is each of the sheep's got an ID number, a name, and a wool color. So the next thing you're going to want to do is create a variable in the header that you can pass that data to. So you can do that with the read URL function. If you give it the class path, that'll point to the source main resources folder in your project, and then you just put the file name there, and you can verify that it works. You save that and hit the preview, and then you'll see that the data from your file comes through to the preview here. So let's say I want to find how much wool of each color I'm going to get. So I can start by grouping my sheep by wool color and sort of see what that gives me. So that's going to give me an object with key value pairs, the keys being the wool color, and then the value is going to be each of the sheep that had that wool color. And after that, I can map through here. And this can be helpful here, this strategy, to just sort of see what the structure of your data is going to be on the output, right? So after I've mapped through those groups, this is sort of what it's going to look like. It's going to be a key with the wool color, and then this I just put in test so that it would evaluate it and I can see what it looks like. But if I want to get more complicated, I can go in here. Let's say I just want to put the names of all of the sheep from each wool color. That's going to give me a list here. So that's, we can take a step back and look at what is actually being passed as the value for each of this. So it's helpful when you're iterating through and you've got sort of nested levels here to see exactly what you're working on, right? So the name, you can see these are the exact sheep that are coming through at this level. So we're going to go back to the name, and then let's say I want to join these into a list, right? Super easy to sort of see what's going on. So let's say some of the wool produce, or some of the sheep produce twice as much wool as others. So I'm going to sort of build this up step by step. Let's see which wool or which sheep produce twice as much wool. Let's say if they've got X in the ID here, they're extra large, and you're getting more wool from them. So we can take that and just to make sure we're getting the syntax right, we can filter by ID contains X, right? So again, we can sort of verify with the output that we're only getting sheep here in this double wool that have an X in the ID. And then it's really simple. You just see how many of those sheep you've got with the size of. You got 2, and just multiply that by 2. And that'll be, let's say, 2 kilos of wool per sheep. Then we can do sort of the same deal here, where we'll take our value, filter this time for the opposite. So where we want the ID. So with the not operator here, we see in the single wool, we'll only get sheep without X. And then we can again do size of. Go. And then to get the total, You can just copy and paste these guys. And that'll be the total amount of gray wool, blue wool, white wool. You can go back then after you've sort of figured out how you're going to lay everything out. You can comment things out or just delete them. So yeah, this is hopefully a helpful approach that you can use to sort of build your Dataweave scripts quickly. I'll leave you with a brief plug here. Concord is going to be releasing weekly MuleSoft quizzes. So we're going to have Dataweave exercises in there. We're going to have exercises on RAML, sort of pointing out different helpful features in Endpoint Platform. So I'll leave my email in the chat if you're interested in hearing more about that. I think we're going to start releasing them in June. Just send me an email and I will keep you updated. So thanks a lot.
Julian, that was awesome, dude. I've been at MuleSoft for 6 years and I did not know this tip. All right, so well done. Love it. I hope it's a benefit to the community as well. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Now, if you want to hold on, you want to win, we're going to turn it back over to Raghav. He's going to be pulling, or actually showing you how he's actually going to be pulling the winners for our raffle stuff that we got today. So turning it over to you. Thanks again, Julian. Turning it over to you, Raghav. Raghav, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
Oops. Hey guys, are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
You see my Teams chat or Wheel of Fortune?
We see the wheelofnames.com.
Okay, all right. I want to make sure I'm not showing the wrong screen. Here we go. I got all the names. Let's, since training is like a high worth vouchers, let's do the picks for the training first. I'm gonna do a couple of shuffles to make sure Wheel of Fortune doesn't pick the same names again. All right, round one for training voucher. Suresh Baka.
Way to go, Suresh. You've got a training voucher.
Please make sure to drop your email to Mike and me so that we can arrange to get you the voucher.
If you want, if you don't know Raghav's email, just go ahead and send it to me. It was the same one I put in the chat room earlier for getting the code, so I'll make sure we get it to you.
Thank you. Yep. Do we have Suresh?
Yep, he's here. He said thanks.
Okay, awesome. Let's go to the next one. Let me shuffle it a couple more times, and then round two for a free training voucher. I feel like a role at a casino, role dealer at casino. Rakesh.
Rakesh, are you still here? You might be on mute or might not have put some in the chat. He's there.
Oh,
good. We got
he's
Rakesh.
there.
Perfect. Perfect.
All right. Make sure to drop your emails. All right. The third training voucher. These are pretty good value. These are like thousands of dollars to get you a seat in free instructor-led training. So I love these. Unfortunate that leaders can't get those.
Tassine, are you here as well still? Got to be present to win. Yes, he is.
Yep.
Perfect. We got Tassine, so that's the third training voucher. All right.
All right. Since all the high value training vouchers are gone, now we are gonna run a raffle for DoorDash gift cards, $25 DoorDash gift cards. We'll run 3 of these.
That's cool.
Jeff, you still here as well?
Yep, I'm here.
All right, Jeff.
I'll shuffle a couple more times and then round 2. Another. All right. We'll do one more.
Nader, are you here as well? Perfect. See him there. Great.
Elva, are you here?
Elva, are you here as well? Elva? Need you to respond in chat or in via voice. Otherwise, we're moving on and doing it again.
All right. I guess we are moving on.
We're doing it again.
I don't see Elva on anymore.
Okay. All right. We'll do another one.
Bawar, are you here as well?
Don't think so.
No.
Oh, we lost Bawar as well. Uh-oh.
All right.
Go again.
Doesn't seem like we lost many people, but
Never been in that.
2 of them of the 6 or 7 that left were winners.
All right. Let's try Sai Anugia.
Sai Anugia?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm here.
All right, Sai. Nice job. Okay. So I think the next 3 are gift cards to Starbucks. Is that correct?
Yep. Make sure to send across your emails and we will email your gift cards. All right, Starbucks. Free coffee.
Prasad.
I think Prasad is also left.
Uh-oh. Go again.
Oops, all the winners left.
If I'm wrong, please pipe up. I'm just searching the participants to see if I find them.
Yep, and everybody seems to be responding in the chat when they have one, so that's good.
Whoa, Julian.
Julian.
Nice.
Well done,
Right.
Julian.
This is rigged.
It's a great night for me.
All right, 2 more.
I think I won a prize last time too. I just wasn't there to claim it.
Shouldn't be leaving early.
Deep, are you still here? All right, Deep is still here. Perfect. 1 more.
All right, let's do the last one.
Good luck, everybody. Last one.
Thank you.
Mary Jo Sabal.
Yeah,
Still
I'm
available?
here.
Perfect. All right. Awesome. Mary Jo, thank you. Everybody, thank you so much. I know we're well over time, so I want to get everybody back to their families. But if there are any questions, you've got my email in the chat. Please feel free. We will put this recorded presentation out on on the Meetup site, and those that email me will, for the winners, will get their e-gift cards. Secondarily, those that emailed me around getting the code, I will send that out as well. But we appreciate your time. Thank you so much. I know it's been virtual. It was tough, but we thank you for for joining, and we hope to see you in the next one. We hope the next one will be in person, but we will definitely find out as it goes. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.